No one expected the crippled girl to walk into the pen, least of all Walter Green, whose voice had just finished echoing across the crowd with a smug final declaration, "No one can ride this Mustang." The crowd, nearly the entire town of Cottonwood Flats, had gathered in a dusty ring around the corral, their eyes glued to the restless, snorting mass of muscle and fury that was Storm, the wild blue roan Mustang who had thrown 12 riders in 10 days. Dust hung heavy in the air. The sun was sinking, turning the sky a smoldering orange, casting long shadows that made Storm look even more mythical, like a creature torn from thunderclouds and fury. The Mustang pawed the ground, flared his nostrils, and shook his mane like a lion warning off challengers. No saddle graced his back, no rope touched his hide. His eyes held nothing but fire, and into that storm walked a girl with braces on her legs and a crutch clenched in her hand. Her name was Emma Crawford, and she moved like someone who had taught herself to ignore pain. Every step across that dirt seemed to challenge reality. Her grandmother's voice cut across the murmurs, sharp, pleading, "Emma, no." But the girl didn't stop. She didn't speak. She didn't raise her hand in defiance. She just kept walking, slowly, deliberately, toward the beast everyone had agreed was untouchable. Laughter rippled through the crowd, low at first, nervous, then louder, meaner. No one had ever seen Emma at a rodeo, on a horse, or even close to one. What did she think she was doing? Some scoffed, others exchanged concerned glances, and a few, the quieter ones, simply stared, caught by something they couldn't explain. She was so small, so fragile. She shouldn't have been there, but she was. And the way she moved, like she belonged in that ring, made people stop mid-sentence and reconsider. At the center of the pen, Storm froze. His body was coiled energy, his hooves planted like a challenge hurled into the earth. But as Emma approached, she didn't reach out a hand or raise a rope. Instead, she lowered herself awkwardly, painfully, down into the dirt. She sat, back turned to the Mustang, facing away from him like he was just wind behind her. Then she did the strangest thing of all. She hummed. A soft, barely audible melody drifted through the silence. A lullaby, maybe, or something older. Something without words, the kind of tune that feels like it belongs to the land. For a moment, even Storm didn't seem to know what to make of it. His ears twitched. He took one step sideways, then another. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the inevitable charge, the explosive buck, the crumpled figure in the dirt. But nothing happened. Time stretched. Emma kept humming. Her back was still turned. She didn't flinch when Storm snorted behind her or when he stamped hard enough to rattle the ground. She just kept humming, as though the terrifying animal behind her didn't exist, or as if he was something else entirely. Someone whispered, "Is she out of her mind?" Another murmured, "She's calming him." But most said nothing, because no one wanted to break the spell that had settled over the corral. And Storm didn't charge. He didn't rear. He didn't bolt. He lowered his head, just slightly. He took one tentative step toward her, then another. Not close enough to touch, not close enough to trust, but closer than he'd ever come to another human without a fight. The people watching didn't understand it. Jackson Ramsey, standing at the back of the crowd with his arms crossed, didn't understand it. Walter Green, whose bet and pride had built this whole ridiculous contest, stood slack-jawed, unable to speak. This wasn't part of the plan. No one had counted on a girl who had to fight to walk, making her way into the pen with nothing but a song. 20 minutes passed, 20 minutes of silence and breath and tension. And in those 20 minutes, something ancient shifted, not just in the Mustang, but in the town, in Emma, the kind of shift that can't be undone. No one could quite explain what they saw that day. Not later, not even in whispers. But they'd all say the same thing. It started with the girl, and with the humming, and it changed everything. The morning frost still clung to the grass at Ramsey Crossroads when Jackson stepped out of his modest house, coffee in hand, dog at his heels. The Wyoming air was crisp and dry, a breath away from snow. At 62, Jackson Ramsey moved a little slower than he used to, but every step was still deliberate. He had a way about him, quiet, sturdy, like old wood that didn't creak until you leaned in close. He'd spent his life working horses, and the lines around his eyes told stories more honest than words ever could. A man with nothing to prove, or so he told himself most days. That morning, though, something gnawed at him, a sense of unfinished business. He leaned on the fence of the round pen, watching a chestnut quarter horse circle with crisp precision, responding to the slightest shift of his weight, a subtle click of his tongue. Training horses was never just about riding. It was about conversation without words, about listening before demanding. Jackson believed that, always had, and that belief had served him well, until the phone calls started drying up, until clients began favoring newfangled methods, until the name Dale Winters started echoing louder than his own. Dale, his former apprentice, now a rising star with clinics and books and YouTube videos. Modern horsemanship, they called it. Treats and praise and round pens filled with mirrors. It worked, sure, but to Jackson it often felt like something was missing. Horses didn't just need kindness. They needed a leader they could respect. That's what he offered. That's what fewer people seemed to want. So when Walter Green's oversized black truck rumbled up his driveway, raising a curtain of dust behind it, Jackson had a feeling it wasn't a friendly visit. Walter was one of those men who wore his wealth like a second skin, starched shirt, spotless boots, belt buckle the size of a small plate. He climbed out with the swagger of someone who hadn't been told no in a long time and didn't plan to hear it now. "Morning, Jackson," he called out with a grin that never reached his eyes. "Got something that might interest you?" Jackson didn't smile. He didn't offer coffee. He just tipped his hat and waited. "I hear you've been turning down clients lately," Walter said, strolling up like he owned the place. "Selective, huh? That why Dale Winters is booked 6 months out?" Jackson kept his voice even. "I don't work with everyone. Never have." Walter chuckled, but there was an edge to it. "Well, I've got something even Dale wouldn't touch. A real piece of work. Mustang. Caught him up in Badlands Pass last month. Best specimen I've ever seen. Blue roan. Mean as sin. Threw a man clean over the fence last week." Jackson's interest stirred despite himself. Not because of the challenge, he wasn't a showman like Walter, but because of the horse. A blue roan from Badlands Pass wasn't just rare, it was legendary, a relic from the last untamed corners of the West. But he kept his expression unreadable. "Mustangs aren't mean," he said. "They're survivors." Walter waved a hand like that was irrelevant. "Call it what you want. Point is, no one can ride him, but I've got a buyer, movie producer from California, wants something authentic for his ranch. Says he'll pay top dollar if the horse can be ridden." Jackson shook his head. "Horses like that need time, months, sometimes more. You can't rush trust." "1 month," Walter said, cutting him off. 30 days, I'll pay double your usual rate. You get him rideable, I make my sale, and you get to prove you're still the best horseman in the county." Jackson glanced at the empty stalls behind him. Mortgage overdue, repairs needed, the money would help. But 30 days wasn't training. It was a gamble. And the stakes weren't just money. It was the horse's future. Still, when Walter mentioned Dale Winters again, how he'd take the job if Jackson passed, it struck a nerve. Pride had a funny way of clouding judgment. "Bring him by," Jackson said at last. "I'll see what I can do." Walter grinned like a man who'd just won a bet he never doubted. "I'll do better than that. He'll be here by sundown." When the truck pulled away, the dust lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Jackson stood there a moment longer, staring down the road, before turning to his dog, Rusty, who had been watching the entire exchange with quiet loyalty. "We're getting too old for this, boy," Jackson muttered. "Both of us." Inside the barn, he began preparations, reinforcing the stall, clearing the pen, setting out clean water and feed, the kind of tasks he could do blindfolded, yet today they felt heavier, the kind of weight that didn't settle in your bones until much later. He didn't know then how much that horse would change things. or that someone completely unexpected would be the key to it all. All he knew was that the clock had started ticking, and for the first time in a long while, Jackson Ramsey had something to prove. Storm didn't explode from the trailer like most wild Mustangs did. He didn't rear, didn't bolt. He didn't give anyone the satisfaction of a spectacle. Instead, he stood in the darkness, hidden behind the trailer walls, breathing like a freight train, refusing to move. The sound of his hooves striking the steel floor echoed like gunshots, but he stayed rooted in place, stubborn in a way that didn't come from fear. It came from defiance, the kind of defiance you earned from years of surviving in a place where nothing was given and everything was fought for. The ranch hands who brought him, rough boys in worn jeans with bruises on their jaws and tired looks in their eyes, didn't try to mask their relief when they stepped away from the trailer door. "Good luck," one of them muttered, rubbing the dark blotch forming under his cheekbone. "He nearly took my head off loading up." Jackson Ramsey stood 10 feet away, arms crossed, face unreadable. He didn't flinch at the sound of Storm's pounding hooves or the sharp clang of a kick striking metal. He'd seen enough Mustangs over the years to know that the ones who stood still like that, silent, coiled, unreadable, were the most dangerous. They weren't wild in the way people expected, not just energy and panic. No, horses like Storm thought. Calculated, measured. They were smart, and smart was always more dangerous than scared. The trailer door creaked as it opened wider, revealing just the outline of the Mustang inside. Blue roan, almost black except for the scatter of frosted hairs across his flanks, and a sharp white star stamped dead center on his forehead, like lightning had marked him. A true desert ghost. Big for a Mustang, too, close to 16 hands, with a wide chest and solid bone structure built for both speed and endurance. He looked like something ancient, like he'd galloped out of the Badlands straight from the pages of myth. Jackson didn't reach for a whip, didn't yell, didn't snap his fingers or clap his hands like some trainers would to force the horse out. He just waited, silent, patient, letting Storm decide. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The crowd that had started to gather around the corral shifted uncomfortably. Whispers rose. Someone laughed nervously. One of the ranch hands leaned toward Jackson and asked if he wanted a lunge whip. "No," Jackson said. "Give him time." And Storm, perhaps more out of curiosity than trust, eventually stepped forward, one hoof, then another. His massive frame emerged slowly, every muscle tense but controlled, eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings, the pen, the barn, the people. All of it. He didn't flinch. He didn't spook. He just stared, the kind of stare that makes you feel like the animal's seeing more of you than you'd like. The moment his hooves hit the dirt, Storm shot forward. Not toward anyone, but around the pen's perimeter, testing every inch of the fence line like a prisoner scoping for weaknesses. His movements were power incarnate, smooth, relentless, breathtaking. Jackson watched in silence, cataloging every flick of the ear, every swish of the tail, every sudden pivot. Storm wasn't just strong. He was thinking, problem-solving, assessing everything. When Walter Green pulled up, grinning behind the wheel of his truck, he climbed out with that same smug energy that made the hair on the back of Jackson's neck rise. "Well," Walter said, arms spread. "Worth every penny, right?" Jackson didn't answer right away. His eyes never left the horse. Finally he said, "You said 30 days?" "That's the deal," Walter replied. "Make him rideable by the end of the month, or I hand him over to Dale. Or worse, send him to Carson Reynolds up in Montana. That guy doesn't waste time with all this build-a-bond nonsense." Jackson's jaw tightened. Carson Reynolds was infamous for fast-tracking Mustangs through fear-based training. Quick results, quick compliance, broken minds. "Storm won't survive Reynolds," Jackson muttered more to himself than to Walter. "Then you better get to work," Walter said with a chuckle. Clock's ticking. After Walter left, the noise of his truck fading down the gravel road, Jackson approached the pen slowly, pausing at the gate. Storm stopped pacing, turned his head, and faced him, not with panic, with challenge, like he was daring Jackson to make the first move. "You're a fighter," Jackson said softly. "That's good. Means you've still got your spirit." He didn't try to enter the pen, didn't wave ropes or toss a saddle blanket. He simply sat down on a worn wooden stool outside the gate and watched. And Storm, after a long minute, resumed his pacing, never taking his eyes fully off the man sitting still just beyond reach. Across the ranch, the wind shifted, stirring the tall grass, carrying with it the scent of the Badlands, the place Storm had come from, the only home he'd ever known. And now he was here, trapped, surrounded, challenged by a man who spoke little, moved less, but seemed to understand more than most. Jackson opened his small leather journal and began to write. Day 1. Name, Storm, Blue Roan. Estimated 7 years. Extremely alert. High intelligence. Alpha disposition. Displays calculated resistance rather than blind panic. Primary motivator unknown. Fear, control, protection, observation required. He paused and looked up. Storm had stopped, was staring at him again, ears half forward. Jackson tapped his pencil against the page, then added, "This horse isn't broken, just betrayed." He closed the journal and leaned back. "We'll figure it out," he murmured. "One day at a time." Storm tossed his head once, snorted, and resumed his circling. But his movements were slower now. Not relaxed, never relaxed, but less frantic. As if something about the man watching him wasn't quite like the others. As if the first line of a new conversation had just been spoken, and both of them were waiting to see what would come next. At Bluebell Cottage, a thin stream of morning light pushed its way through the gauzy curtains and settled across the quilt Emma Crawford had pulled tightly around her shoulders. She lay still, eyes open, listening to the familiar creak of the floorboards below as her grandmother moved through the kitchen, setting out dishes with practiced efficiency. The air held that cool edge of early spring that hadn't quite given way to warmth yet, and Emma could already hear the faint chirp of birds staking their claims in the old cottonwood trees out back. But she didn't stir, not yet. There was a heaviness to her limbs this morning, a resistance that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with what had become a morning ritual, forcing herself to face the world despite how her body made it harder than it used to be. By the time Margaret called up to her, Emma had already pushed herself upright, swinging her stronger right leg over the edge of the bed first and carefully bracing the weaker left. The old wooden crutches leaned beside her nightstand like twin sentries, always present, always waiting. She'd used them for years, but that didn't mean she was used to them. Some days they felt like an extension of herself. Other days they felt like a sentence. She made her way downstairs slowly, each step a small triumph masked as routine. Margaret had made toast and scrambled eggs, setting the table just as she always did, every piece in its place. "Eat something," she said, not looking up as Emma shuffled to the table. "You've got therapy at 11. Emma nodded, but didn't respond. She picked at the eggs, pushing them around her plate, chewing mechanically when Margaret raised an eyebrow. Her thoughts weren't here. They hadn't been here since the moment she heard about the Mustang. She'd looked it up, of course, late into the night, after her grandmother had gone to bed. The wild blue roan from Badlands Pass, caught in a roundup. No rider could stay on him. The townspeople whispered about him like he was a ghost or a myth, and now he was at Ramsey Crossroads. Emma didn't know why the thought wouldn't leave her alone. There were plenty of horses in Cottonwood Flats, even a few she'd worked with at the therapeutic riding center, but this one felt different. She could feel it in her chest like a hum, as though the story of that Mustang had been written in the same language her soul understood. At the therapy center later that morning, Dr. Rebecca Morgan greeted her with a kind smile, one Emma knew all too well. It was the kind of smile you gave someone who had given up before they even walked through the door. "Just watching today?" Dr. Morgan asked gently, though she already knew the answer. Emma nodded, parking herself near the paddock fence and folding her hands tightly in her lap. She hated that look of concern. She hated even more that she hadn't earned it without reason. "Any pain?" Dr. Morgan asked as she crouched beside her. "Nothing new," Emma replied, which was her way of saying everything still hurt the way it always did. But pain wasn't what kept her out of the saddle. It was fear. The fall still replayed in her head like a film on a loop. 1 second she was moving in sync with her therapy horse. The next she was on the ground, breath knocked out of her, unable to feel her left side properly for weeks. Everyone said it was the spook, the noise, the unpredictable nature of horses. But Emma knew the truth. It was her body, her limitations, her fault. "You know," Dr. Morgan said after a pause, "there's more than one way to work with horses. You don't always have to be on their backs to be with them." Emma gave a half smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She appreciated the kindness, but she didn't want alternatives. She wanted to ride again. She just didn't know how to say it out loud. Later, after therapy ended and the other patients left, Emma wheeled herself to the far paddock where a few of the center's horses grazed quietly. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a slice of apple, her hand trembling slightly as she extended it over the fence. A soft-nosed bay mare ambled over and took it gently, her eyes calm and curious. "That's Buttercup," said a voice behind her. Emma turned to see Tommy Peterson standing there, arms crossed, cowboy hat pushed back just enough to reveal the easy grin he always wore. The local rodeo star, the golden boy of Cottonwood Flats. He leaned against the fence with casual confidence, watching the horse. "She's pretty," Emma said, turning back to the mare. "You've got a good eye," Tommy replied. "Always had a feel for horses." Emma didn't answer. They'd gone to school together, but they'd never really been close. He was the kind of person who drew people in like a magnet, while she'd always felt like she was standing just outside the circle, watching. "I saw you ride last year," Tommy continued, "at the therapy center's showcase. You had amazing balance." "Had," Emma said quietly. "Not anymore. One fall doesn't mean you've lost everything." "It does when your legs don't work the same after," Emma snapped, sharper than she meant to. "When you can't even get back on without help." Tommy looked like he wanted to say something else, but just then Margaret's old sedan pulled into the parking lot. Emma turned toward it. "That's my ride." "Hey, Emma," Tommy called as she moved away. "There's a new Mustang in town. Walter Green brought him in from the Badlands. No one's been able to stay on him. Thought you might want to know." Emma paused mid-roll, her back still to him. "Why would I care about that?" Tommy shrugged. "You always liked the wild ones. Remember that field trip in 5th grade? You talked about the Mustangs for weeks." Emma didn't answer, didn't turn around, but the image had already formed in her mind. A Mustang, wild, untamed, and cornered. A creature born to run, now locked behind fences. It didn't matter what she said out loud. Inside, something had stirred awake. Because she knew what it felt like to be trapped inside a body that wouldn't cooperate, to have people look at you like you were fragile porcelain when all you wanted was to prove you were still whole. That night, at home, as the sky turned amber behind the hills, Emma sat by her window and stared out toward the distant stretch of land that marked Ramsey Crossroads. She imagined the Mustang there, pacing in circles, restless, fierce. And she imagined herself standing near him, not riding, not commanding, just being. Maybe that was enough to start. "Tommy mentioned a Mustang today," she said softly as Margaret served dinner. "That man buys everything he sees," Margaret replied without looking up. "Probably just wants to show off again. They say no one can ride him." Margaret set down the plate a little too hard. "And you can stop thinking whatever it is you're thinking. Wild Mustangs are dangerous, Emma. Your father always said so." Emma stared at her plate. Dad also said they were misunderstood, that they just needed patience. Her grandmother softened, just a little. He was a wonderful man, but not always practical. There was a long silence between them as the sun sank behind the trees. Emma picked at her food, her thoughts miles away, circling the round pen like a shadow. Maybe the Mustang didn't need to be ridden. Maybe, just maybe, he needed to be understood. The Cottonwood meeting house hadn't seen a crowd like this in years. Cars lined the dirt road all the way back to the hardware store, and inside, every creaking wooden bench and folding chair was filled. The air buzzed with restless energy, half anticipation, half tension, as neighbors exchanged whispers and side glances, craning to see who else had shown up. Emma sat beside her grandmother near the back, tucked close to the aisle where her crutches leaned quietly against her seat. Margaret had insisted on arriving early to find a good spot, but Emma knew it was also to avoid a scene. She'd seen the way her grandmother's eyes narrowed whenever someone stared a little too long at her braces or the way she walked. Walter Green, towering and broad-shouldered in a crisp white shirt and boots too polished for ranch work, stood near the front like a man used to being listened to. His voice carried easily over the murmur of conversation, loud and authoritative, not so much speaking as declaring. Several of his ranch hands flanked the walls like bodyguards, arms crossed, boots planted. Emma spotted Jackson Ramsey near the side wall, standing alone with his hat in his hand, eyes narrowed in his usual thoughtful way. He was watching, not performing. That was the difference between him and Walter, and maybe why she instinctively trusted one and not the other. Mayor Wilson struggled to bring order to the room, tapping his pen against the podium with more urgency than effectiveness. "All right, folks, let's settle down. We've got a packed agenda tonight and a lot of strong opinions, so let's try to keep things civil." That earned a few snickers from the front row, where some of the older ranchers leaned back with crossed arms, ready for a show. As the mayor began detailing the Bureau of Land Management's new proposal to reduce the wild horse population in Whispering Plains by nearly half, Emma leaned forward slightly, her pulse quickening. She knew this part. She'd read everything she could find online in the past few days, from government documents to blog posts by wild horse advocates. The official reason was always the same: drought conditions, overgrazing, land mismanagement. But underneath the bureaucratic language was a simple truth. There were people who didn't want wild horses on land that could be used for something more profitable. Walter was the first to speak when the floor opened. He stood like he was addressing a courtroom, arms open wide, voice booming. "I'm not saying I hate horses, I've got a few fine ones myself, but these herds, they're out of control. Tearing up pasture that should be for cattle, drinking up water reserves faster than we can replace them. I say we round them up and relocate the lot." A ripple of murmurs and a few scattered claps followed, but not everyone was on Walter's side. From the far corner, Samuel Blackfeather slowly stood, his movements deliberate, dignified. The elder from the reservation didn't need volume to command attention. His voice, when it came, was soft but carried easily. "The Mustangs have roamed these lands longer than any of us, before ranches, before fences. They belong to the earth in a way none of us ever will." "They're not native," Walter snapped. "They're feral, just overgrown livestock." "Neither are cattle," someone shot back, drawing scattered laughter and a few nods from those who didn't appreciate Walter's iron grip on county land. Emma sat in rapt attention, watching the clash of ideologies unfold like a slow-burning wildfire. She knew it wasn't just about land or grass. It was about power, control. And for people like Walter Green, anything he couldn't own or profit from was considered a threat. But the room quieted again when Walter changed the subject. "Speaking of Mustangs," he said, casting a wide grin over the crowd, "I've got one coming in tomorrow from Badlands Pass. Meanest piece of horseflesh you've ever seen. 3 men tried to ride him. None lasted more than 5 seconds. But Jackson Ramsey here," he pointed toward the side of the room, "thinks he can train him in 30 days. All eyes turned to Jackson, who shifted slightly but didn't back down. The mayor raised an eyebrow. "Is that true, Mr. Ramsey?" Jackson straightened, stepping forward with a quiet authority that didn't need to compete with Walter's volume. "I agreed to work with the horse, that's all." "Come on, Jackson," Walter pushed. "Tell them what you said. Something about there being no such thing as an untrainable horse?" Jackson's jaw tightened. I said every horse is different. Some need more time, some need more trust. Walter wasn't done. So how about this? We make it a little more interesting. 1 month from today. If you can train that Mustang well enough for someone, anyone, to ride him, I'll pay triple your fee. But if you can't..." He let the silence stretch, smug satisfaction tugging at the corners of his mouth. Maybe it's time we all admit that Dale Winters and his fancy new methods are the future, not you. The challenge hung in the air like the scent of lightning before a storm. The room erupted in murmurs and speculation. Emma's heart raced. She glanced at Jackson, who stood perfectly still, eyes locked on Walter. He wasn't a man who played games, but this was personal. A man's livelihood, pride, and philosophy of horsemanship laid bare for public judgment. "You're on," Jackson said finally, his voice calm and cold as steel. The buzz in the room doubled. Emma's grandmother shook her head. "This is exactly the kind of foolishness I didn't want you around," she whispered sharply. "Let's go." But Emma's mind was already racing ahead. She didn't care about the bet or the money. She cared about the Mustang, the one no one could ride, the one who needed time and patience, the one no one seemed to understand, except maybe Jackson Ramsey. And something told her, deep in the marrow of her bones, that she had to see that horse. Not just from afar, not in stories, up close. Because just like that, a wild Mustang had become more than a headline or town gossip. He had become a symbol of something she thought she'd lost. Possibility. The wind was sharp the next morning as Jackson Ramsey stepped outside, the kind of cold that sliced straight through a man's coat and left no room for hesitation. Frost clung to the blades of grass across the paddocks like tiny glass shards, and his breath hung in the air in puffs as he crossed toward the barn. Despite the icy morning, something in him stirred with uneasy energy. He had a wild Mustang arriving within the hour, and everything about this horse already felt different. Not just in temperament, but in consequence. Jackson had worked with countless problem horses before, trained animals others had written off, but none had come with this much public scrutiny, or with the added pressure of proving himself to the entire town, all thanks to Walter Green's theatrics. Rusty, his aging cattle dog, trotted along at his heels, tail wagging slow and steady like it had every day for the past 12 years. Jackson reached the barn and began his routine, feeding the quarter horses, checking water levels, inspecting gates and stalls. He worked with quiet precision, as always, but his mind wasn't on the feed buckets or the tack room. It was in the round pen, where in a matter of minutes the future of his reputation would be snorting and stomping and sizing him up like a rival. At exactly 9:01, the rumble of a heavy-duty truck announced the Mustang's arrival. Jackson emerged from the barn to find a long stock trailer pulling up the drive, its sides reinforced and scarred with the signs of a rough journey. Walter Green wasn't in the cab, but two of his ranch hands, Cody and Marco, jumped down and moved to the back of the trailer, both bearing the unmistakable expressions of men who'd seen trouble. "He's a mean one," Cody said, his voice strained, gesturing toward the trailer with a split lip and a purpling bruise on his jaw. "Didn't like being loaded, kicked straight through the gate rail and almost took Marco's arm off." "Name's Storm," Marco added, rolling his shoulder with a wince. "You'll know why in a minute." Jackson nodded, giving nothing away. He moved to the back of the trailer, keeping his steps slow and deliberate. The horse hadn't even shown his face yet, but the sharp thud of hooves against metal made it clear the Mustang was alert, agitated, and fully aware of his confinement. Jackson took a breath and surveyed the chute system he'd rigged the day before, a controlled transfer path from the trailer to the round pen, no direct handling, no ropes, just space and observation. The kind of setup that respected the fact that a wild horse had no reason to trust a man. "You ready?" Cody asked. Jackson gave a short nod. "Open it slow, no shouting, no sudden moves." Cody pulled the latch and swung the heavy gate wide. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, like a shadow emerging from storm clouds, the Mustang stepped into view. He was unlike anything Jackson had expected. larger than most wild-caught horses, easily 16 hands, with a thick, muscular build that spoke of raw survival power. His coat was dark blue roan, nearly black in some places, with a scattering of white hairs that shimmered like frost. But it was the marking on his forehead that caught Jackson's attention, the perfect white star, bright against the storm-dark fur. Storm stood frozen, ears twitching, nostrils flaring, eyes scanning every inch of his new surroundings. Jackson didn't move. The Mustang didn't bolt. Instead, he stepped hesitantly into the chute, muscles coiled like springs, each movement a mix of curiosity and deep, feral distrust. When he finally crossed into the round pen, he exploded into motion, galloping the perimeter in a blur of hooves and dust, testing every inch of the fencing, looking for escape. It was a beautiful, brutal dance, the raw power of something that refused to be cornered, and the steady patience of a man who'd seen it all before. "He's a lot," Cody said, watching in awe as the Mustang reared and spun, kicking dirt against the rails. Jackson didn't respond. His eyes were locked on Storm, who had now stopped at the far edge of the pen, turned and stared at him. The stare wasn't wild in the senseless way of panic. It was intelligent, intense, and cold. The kind of look a creature gives when it's been hunted, trapped, and survived. "You said a month," Jackson murmured, more to himself than anyone else. 30 days, Cody confirmed, hauling the trailer latch shut. "Walter wants him broke by the end of the month. Got a Hollywood buyer coming to see him." Jackson clenched his jaw. That was the part Walter hadn't told him before. A buyer from California, someone looking for a photogenic Mustang for a private ranch, or worse, a film project. Storm wasn't a character on a screen. He was real, bone-deep wild, and being forced into a 30-day clock for someone's profit made Jackson's stomach turn. After the trailer rumbled away and the dust settled, Jackson spent the afternoon just watching. He didn't enter the pen. He didn't rattle buckets or call the horse's name. He just sat on a stool outside the rail, notebook in hand, making observations. Storm was everything he'd been told, and more, aggressive but not erratic, fearful but calculated. He didn't charge without reason, didn't panic blindly. He watched, he waited. He tested boundaries like a strategist, not a brute. By sundown, Jackson had written only 2 words in his journal. Too smart. And then, beneath it, after another hour of silence, not impossible. At Bluebell Cottage, Emma sat at her window with her chin resting on the windowsill, eyes scanning the horizon where she imagined Ramsey Crossroads lay beyond the trees. She'd spent all afternoon reading about Mustangs again, her schoolwork pushed aside. She knew she wouldn't sleep that night, not with the thought of a wild horse pacing a training pen somewhere nearby, a creature just as trapped and misunderstood as she sometimes felt in her own skin. They'd named him Storm, and already, though she'd never seen him, Emma felt like she understood exactly what kind of storm he was, the kind that comes in quietly, all tension and warning winds before it breaks something wide open. The sky had just begun to lighten when Jackson stepped out onto the porch with a mug of black coffee in hand. The early morning chill clung to the air, not quite frost, but sharp enough to sting the skin. Across the paddock, fog crept low along the fence lines like a ghost dragging its hem across the grass. It was day 2 with the Mustang, and while Jackson had spent a lifetime learning that patience was key, the ticking of Walter Green's 30-day countdown echoed louder with each passing sunrise. Today would not be about pushing boundaries, not yet. Today would be about observation, establishing presence, and learning Storm's rhythm, not forcing him into Jackson's. Storm stood near the far end of the round pen, still, but not idle. His head was up, ears constantly flicking, eyes ever watchful. He was a horse built for survival, shaped by mountains, weather, and threats, none of them human. That kind of independence didn't vanish just because someone put up fencing. It stayed in the bones, in the posture, in the way Storm moved like everything in the world could turn dangerous at any moment. And yet, Something had shifted. He wasn't racing the fence anymore, not like he had on arrival. He was watching Jackson, just as Jackson was watching him. Two creatures of habit, feeling each other out without words. Jackson pulled his stool closer to the pen and sat quietly, resting his elbows on his knees, the same way he had for years with nervous colts and abused rescues. He didn't whistle, didn't click, didn't even look Storm in the eye. Horses understood pressure and energy better than people ever gave them credit for, and Storm needed space more than he needed direction, at least for now. He placed an apple slice gently inside the pen, just within reach beyond the fence rail, then leaned back again. It wasn't bait, it was an offering. Storm noticed it immediately but didn't approach. That was fine. The point wasn't the apple, it was trust. Everything else would be built on that. Time passed like the slow burn of sunrise. The fog began to lift. Birds stirred in the distant trees. And still they sat, man and Mustang, sharing the silence of morning in a standoff of mutual evaluation. It wasn't until nearly an hour later that Storm finally moved, not toward the apple, but sideways, easing a few feet closer, ears half-pinned in suspicion. He stopped, sniffed the air, then took another step, then another. It was the smallest movement in the world, and it was everything. When Storm finally reached the apple slice and plucked it delicately from the ground, Jackson didn't move a muscle. He just nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. Progress wasn't about breaking a horse's will or showing dominance. It was about proving, inch by inch, that you weren't the enemy, that you saw them, respected them. That was the difference between real horsemanship and the showboating Green was turning this whole ordeal into. By the time the sun had climbed above the cottonwoods, Jackson had filled half a page in his leather-bound journal, notes on posture, eye contact, movement patterns, and beneath it all, he scrawled one word in bigger, darker letters: responsive. Later that morning, a dusty Subaru pulled into the drive, and Emma stepped out slowly, leaning on a single crutch. Margaret was behind the wheel, arms folded as she waited beside the car. Emma approached the pen with a quiet reverence, her eyes locked on Storm from the moment she saw him. She didn't speak, didn't wave, just stood beside the fence like it was a sacred altar, watching the Mustang with unblinking attention. Jackson saw the look on her face and understood it instantly. It wasn't awe, it was recognition. "You can sit if you want," he said quietly, gesturing to the stool next to his. Emma took the seat, adjusting the crutch beside her with practiced ease. "Has he let you touch him yet?" Jackson shook his head. "Not yet, but he took an apple slice earlier. That's more than I expected for day 2. "He watches everything," she said softly, eyes never leaving the Mustang. "His ears, his muscles, even his breathing. He's tracking every move you make, even when he pretends he isn't." Jackson glanced at her, surprised. That kind of observation took years for most horse people to develop. Emma spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to live by reading the world around her, because her own body didn't always obey. He saw it now, how she studied Storm not with fear or pity, but with understanding. She wasn't seeing the danger, she was seeing the wound underneath it. "You've been around horses before," he said, not as a question. She nodded slowly. "Therapy riding, until the fall. Jackson had heard about it from Dr. Morgan in passing. The accident had set her back physically and emotionally. What he hadn't realized until now was that Emma wasn't just another kid who liked horses. She had the feel, that intangible instinct, the one you couldn't teach, only recognize. "Want to help?" he asked. Emma blinked. "Help?" "Just observation," Jackson clarified. "You see things I might miss, and he doesn't seem nervous with you nearby." Her face lit up in a way Jackson hadn't seen before, not even yesterday. A spark, quick and bright, like someone had opened a door inside her that had been locked for too long. She nodded once. "Yes, I'd like that." From that moment forward, a quiet rhythm began to develop. Jackson didn't rush. Emma didn't push. They simply watched. They noticed the way Storm flicked his ears when the wind shifted, the way he lifted his head whenever the old barn owl hooted from the loft, the way he placed his hooves precisely, like the ground itself might betray him if he didn't step just right. Emma started bringing apple slices from home, offering suggestions on placement. Storm learned her scent, learned her presence, and didn't shy from it. That afternoon, after Margaret picked Emma up and the ranch fell quiet again, Jackson walked back to the pen with another apple in hand. Storm came closer than he had before, close enough that Jackson could feel his breath. "Looks like we've both got ourselves a helper," Jackson murmured. "And maybe, just maybe, you've got yourself a reason to start trusting." He held out the apple, and this time Storm didn't hesitate. By the time day 8 arrived, the rhythm at Ramsey Crossroads had become almost ritualistic. Morning chores, quiet observation, Storm's training exercises, and Emma's visits had turned into something more than routine. They were grounding moments, steadying both horse and human. The Mustang had made noticeable strides over the last few days. He now approached the fence voluntarily, not with aggression or wariness, but with the kind of tentative curiosity that signaled a fragile trust in the making. Jackson didn't call it progress aloud, not yet, because he knew better than to jinx it. Horses like Storm, especially ones ripped from the wild, didn't give their trust lightly, and they could take it back just as easily. That morning, Jackson was brushing down one of his quarter horses when he heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching over gravel. He stepped out of the barn to see a vehicle he hadn't expected to see so soon. Dr. Morgan's SUV, its silver paint catching the mid-morning sun, rolled up to the main house. When the car stopped, Emma stepped out of the passenger side, wearing a look of quiet determination. She held only one crutch today, her balance still uncertain but steadier than he remembered. Dr. Morgan exited the driver's side, greeting Jackson with a nod. Jackson's first thought was that something had gone wrong, another setback, a medical warning, a concern from Margaret. But the look on Emma's face didn't suggest retreat. It suggested purpose. "She wanted to come early today," Dr. Morgan explained. "I had a patient emergency and couldn't stay long. Margaret approved the early drop-off." "Glad to have her," Jackson said, nodding toward the observation stool beside the pen. Emma didn't need an invitation. She moved slowly but deliberately to the stool, placed her crutch beside it, and sat down with a satisfied breath. "I brought something for him," she said, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a small plastic bag of dried apple slices. "Homemade, no sugar." Jackson accepted the offering with a quiet smile. "Let's see what he thinks." They waited together while Jackson scattered the apple slices strategically along the fence's edge. When Storm appeared from the far corner of the pen and caught their scent, his ears pricked forward with interest. He didn't bolt. He didn't snort and back away. He came, slowly, cautiously, his hooves stirring the dust in steady rhythm. He stopped just short of the nearest slice, gave a long, low exhale, and reached out to take it. Emma barely breathed. "He's calmer today. Yesterday was the first day he didn't spook at the saddle blanket when I draped it near the fence," Jackson replied, watching Storm chew with surprising contentment. "That's no small thing." Emma nodded thoughtfully, her eyes never leaving the Mustang. "He's not mean, just tired of being scared." Jackson glanced sideways at her. That's exactly it. They spent the better part of an hour just watching Storm move, eat, explore. Emma had begun to narrate her observations, not in a stream of idle chatter, but with the perceptiveness of someone who saw nuances others missed. She noted the way Storm's tail flicked more slowly now, a sign of reduced agitation. The way his left ear occasionally remained tilted toward Jackson, even as he focused elsewhere. The subtle shift in his breathing when Emma stood or moved, interested but no longer alarmed. Jackson listened, nodding now and again, but saying little, because he didn't need to. She saw it all. As the session wound down, Jackson handed her a pole used for ground desensitization, a soft, flexible fiberglass wand often used to introduce horses to unfamiliar stimuli without physical contact. Today, instead of attaching a training flag or string, he secured a slice of apple to the end with a rubber band. "Want to give it a try?" he asked. Emma's brow furrowed. "Me? He's getting used to you. Might be time he starts learning to take from you directly, just not with your hands yet." She hesitated, glancing at Storm, then back at Jackson. "What do I do?" "Hold it steady. Let him decide. Let him come to it on his own terms." Emma adjusted her grip, her weak hand providing support as best it could. With Jackson's guidance, she extended the pole carefully, holding it just over the fence and into the pen. Storm eyed the strange contraption with suspicion. He paced once, twice, snorted softly, but he didn't bolt. He didn't turn away. "He's thinking it through," Emma said quietly, her focus absolute. "Good," Jackson said. "Give him the time to figure it out. That's half of training, knowing when not to act." Storm circled once more, then approached the pole with wary interest. He stretched his neck, nostrils flaring as he investigated the scent. In a sudden but smooth motion, he took the apple slice, chewed it slowly, and backed away, not out of fear but simple habit. Emma's face lit up. "He took it." "You gave it," Jackson corrected. "That matters." They tried again, and then a third time, each repetition easing the Mustang's tension just a little more. By the final slice, Storm stayed near the fence even after taking the treat, looking at Emma with those intelligent, wary eyes that still burned with defiance, but no longer with panic. Dr. Morgan returned just as they were wrapping up, observing from a distance before approaching. "That went well, I take it?" "He took food directly from Emma, through the pole," Jackson said. "First time he's accepted anything that close from anyone but me." "That's significant." "More than significant," he said. "It's direction." Later, after Emma had gone and the ranch had quieted again, Jackson walked back to the pen with his journal in hand. He watched Storm, who now paced with a measured energy, stopping occasionally to sniff the fence where Emma had been. Jackson made note of that. He made note of everything. But most of all, he wrote one line in large, deliberate letters across the page. "He's chosen her." He didn't know yet what that meant, not in practical terms, not with Walter's deadline looming, not with all the safety concerns Margaret would undoubtedly raise if the idea ever formed into something more. But in the space between instinct and knowledge, between what made sense and what simply felt true, Jackson could feel it settling inside him like the beginnings of an answer he hadn't even thought to ask yet. Storm had chosen Emma. The only question now was whether the world would let that matter. The days leading up to the town meeting buzzed with anticipation, rumors swirling like prairie dust across Cottonwood Flats. Everyone had something to say about Walter Green's wild Mustang, about the bet with Jackson Ramsey, about whether the legendary horseman still had what it took, or if Dale Winters and his flashy modern methods had rendered Jackson obsolete. But beneath that chatter, a quieter story was unfolding, one not many had noticed, at least not yet. At Bluebell Cottage, Emma Crawford was preparing for something she hadn't dared believe in for a long time. The chance to be close to a horse again, not as a patient or a passive observer, but as someone whose presence made a difference. And for her, that chance began not with reins or saddles, but with knowledge. Emma's laptop had barely cooled over the past week, open nearly every waking hour between therapy sessions, school assignments, and quiet meals with her grandmother. She devoured every article she could find on Mustang behavior, on trauma in wild horses, on desensitization techniques and liberty training. She wasn't just fascinated, she was driven. There was something about Storm that made her feel like she wasn't studying a subject but unlocking a language. Her bedroom walls, once decorated with soft watercolor prints, were now tacked with notes, diagrams, highlighted printouts, and sketches of horses with annotations scribbled along their spines and legs. Storm had never been to her home, but in many ways he was everywhere now. Margaret noticed. Of course she did. She noticed how Emma pushed herself during physical therapy without being told, how she kept her shoulders straighter and her gaze sharper. And Margaret, who had once feared that Emma was fading into a kind of quiet resignation, found herself cautiously hopeful. She didn't fully understand what the Mustang meant to her granddaughter, but she recognized the energy it had awakened. That energy crackled between them the night of the town meeting as they got ready in the fading light of dusk. Emma wore a simple cardigan and jeans, her braces polished, and her crutch newly adjusted to help her move more efficiently. Margaret, in her neatly pressed skirt and soft grey blouse, tucked her hair behind one ear as she picked up her purse. "You don't have to say anything tonight," Margaret told her gently as they stepped onto the porch. "We're just there to listen." Emma gave a small smile. "I know, but what if I want to say something?" Margaret paused, her eyes searching Emma's face. "Then you'll know when the time is right." The Cottonwood meeting house was packed by the time they arrived. Folding chairs had been added to accommodate the crowd, but people still stood along the walls and leaned in doorways. It felt more like a revival than a local policy meeting. On one side, Walter Green held court, booming and brash, his voice loud enough to carry over the soft hum of conversation. On the other, seated quietly in the back, was Jackson Ramsey, hat low, coat collar turned up, saying nothing but missing nothing. Emma spotted him right away, and when Jackson caught her eye, he gave the faintest nod of recognition. It wasn't a greeting, exactly, but something deeper, an acknowledgement. She wasn't just a visitor anymore. Mayor Wilson called the meeting to order, and the room gradually settled into a tense, expectant hush. The agenda was simple: discuss the Bureau of Land Management's proposed reduction of wild Mustang herds on the Whispering Plains due to drought and overgrazing. But the conversation, predictably, went much further. Walter stood early in the discussion, speaking with theatrical disgust about the herds damaging land that could be used for cattle. "It's a question of priorities," he declared, pounding one fist into his open palm. "We can't keep feeding animals that don't serve a purpose." A few ranchers nodded in agreement, but murmurs of dissent followed. Then Samuel Blackfeather rose from his seat near the back. The room fell silent. His voice didn't need volume to command attention. "The Mustangs were here before our fences, before our grazing contracts, before anyone in this room was born. They're not just animals, they are history running on 4 legs: spirit, memory, motion. To call them purposeless is to forget what land and freedom mean." The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. Emma sat up straighter, heart pounding. She didn't know Samuel well, but she felt a fierce gratitude for him in that moment. She looked around the room and saw the shift. Some people crossed their arms more tightly. Others nodded slowly. And then, just when the tension seemed poised to snap, Walter pivoted with theatrical precision. "Speaking of Mustangs," he said, with the smug smile of a man unveiling a card he'd been saving, "mine arrives tomorrow. Caught him up at Badlands Pass. They say no one can ride him, but Jackson Ramsey thinks he can do it in 30 days. A wave of whispers and laughter moved through the room. All eyes turned to Jackson, who hadn't spoken yet. The mayor, clearly caught off guard, looked toward him with a raised brow. "Is that true, Mr. Ramsey?" Jackson stood slowly, tipping his hat before answering. "I agreed to work with the horse, that's all." But Walter wasn't done. "Let's make it interesting," he said, his voice rising again. 30 days from tomorrow. If someone can ride him, even just for 30 seconds, I'll triple Jackson's fee. If not, well, maybe it's time to admit Dale Winters has the right approach after all." The room erupted into debate. Emma heard Tommy Peterson's name mentioned more than once. Of course, he'd want to try. He always did when there was a spotlight involved. But even amid the chaos, she couldn't take her eyes off Jackson. There was a look on his face she didn't recognize. It wasn't anger or pride. It was something more personal, a quiet conflict. Emma turned to her grandmother and whispered, "I want to see that Mustang." Margaret's response was instant and sharp. "Absolutely not. That's no place for you." but Emma barely heard her. She was already thinking of how to get there, of what she would say, of how she could see him, the horse no one could ride. Something inside her had already decided. It was a spark lit by the sight of Jackson, by the defiance in Samuel's voice, by the very idea that a wild thing could still choose its own path in a world so eager to shape and control. That night, as the crowd filtered out into the cool darkness of Cottonwood Flats, people buzzing about the challenge and Jackson's acceptance, Emma remained quiet. She walked beside her grandmother, her gait uneven but steady, and her mind spinning with the possibilities. She wasn't sure what she would do next, only that she had to be part of it, because something told her this Mustang, Storm, wasn't just a wild horse to be broken or bet on. He was something more, and so was she. The sun had barely risen over the distant hills when Jackson Ramsey stood alone at the round pen, fingers curled around a hot mug of black coffee that steamed in the chill morning air. Day 30. The final sunrise of a month that had tested every ounce of his experience, instinct, and patience. It should have felt like the end of a long road, but instead it felt like the beginning of something far more important. The past month hadn't just been about gentling a wild horse. It had been about watching something unexpected unfold between that horse and someone the world had long since underestimated. Jackson looked into the round pen where Storm stood grazing calmly, the same Mustang who had arrived 30 days earlier like a hurricane in a steel box, eyes wild and breath ragged, striking at anything that moved. Now he watched the rancher with awareness rather than fear, his posture alert but relaxed, as if sensing that today would be different. Across the field, the gravel crunched under the tires of Margaret Crawford's sedan. Jackson didn't need to check his watch. Emma was never late, not for this. He walked toward the driveway, and his chest tightened when he saw her stepping out of the car, not with the careful hesitation he'd seen in the early days, but with deliberate, practiced confidence. Her crutch was in her hand, but her weight leaned less on it than it had before. She walked like someone who trusted her body again, even when it didn't cooperate perfectly. Margaret followed with narrowed eyes, every muscle in her body pulled taut with protective concern. Behind them, Dr. Morgan emerged from her SUV, her expression unreadable, but her eyes focused. They all knew what today was, and each of them was measuring risk against reward in their own way. Jackson greeted them with a quiet nod. "We'll keep it brief, controlled, just as we discussed." Margaret said nothing at first, her lips pressed into a thin line, but finally gave a stiff nod. Dr. Morgan approached Emma, did a quick visual check, asked about her balance and pain level. Emma answered calmly, clearly. The girl who once shrank from these questions now carried herself like someone with a purpose. The only nervousness she betrayed was in the subtle way she clenched her fists, then relaxed them again and again. In the round pen, Jackson secured Storm with a lightweight training halter. The Mustang's ears flicked at the sounds outside the pen, but he remained grounded. The month of work, hours of gentle repetition, of patience, of watching and waiting had brought them here. He'd been saddled, ground-driven, allowed stirrup pressure, accepted a mounting block, and now this last step, not just allowing weight on his back, but accepting a rider. Only today the rider would be Emma. There were easier choices. Jackson had no shortage of experienced young riders who'd offered to be the one to make the final mount. Tommy Peterson had practically made a campaign out of it. Walter Green, despite his usual theatrics, had pushed for it to be a public event, complete with press and townsfolk and maybe even a drone camera or two. But Jackson had made a decision. No fanfare, no crowd, no distraction. Just them, just the people who had truly walked the path with this horse. Emma approached the mounting block with slow, careful steps. Storm's head rose slightly, his muscles tensing. Not with fear, Jackson thought, but recognition. She spoke to him softly, her voice steady and sure, and he exhaled with a low breath that seemed to signal understanding. Jackson held the lead line loosely, prepared to intervene in an instant, but not expecting to. Emma climbed the mounting block slowly, bracing with one arm while swinging her leg over the saddle with practiced care. The modifications they'd made, the shorter stirrups, the custom handle grip, the softer saddle, had all been tested. Still, it wasn't equipment that made this work. It was the bond. Her right leg found the stirrup. Her left hung more loosely, not quite as secure, but positioned well enough to keep her centered. For a long second, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to pause. Emma placed her hands gently on the hornless saddle pommel and inhaled. Storm shifted his weight, an instinctive readjustment, and then stood still again. One breath. Two. Jackson's heart pounded louder than any hoofbeat he'd ever heard. Emma looked down at him. "Okay," she said, her voice low. "Sure. I'm ready." Jackson gave the slightest tug on the lead line, just enough to cue Storm into a slow walk around the pen. The Mustang hesitated at first, unsure, then stepped forward. One step, then another. He moved like a horse measuring his rider, measuring himself. But he walked. Calmly, confidently, steady beneath a girl whose entire body once betrayed her every step. Margaret pressed her hands over her mouth. Dr. Morgan stood frozen in place. Jackson didn't breathe, not until Storm completed a full circuit around the pen with Emma balanced atop him, her grip firm, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled, a slow, luminous expression that changed her whole face. She wasn't just riding a horse, she was flying. When the lap was complete, Jackson signaled for a halt. Storm stopped without resistance. Emma remained seated for just a moment longer, soaking in the moment. Then, with careful grace, she dismounted. Her legs trembled as they hit the ground. Jackson caught her elbow instinctively, but she shook her head. "I'm okay," she said. "I did it." And she had. They both had. Storm had allowed his first rider. Emma had climbed a mountain most had said was too steep. Not for fame, not for money, but for freedom, the kind that lives in the soul. Jackson walked her back to Margaret and Dr. Morgan. No one said anything at first. Margaret was crying silently, shoulders shaking. Dr. Morgan had tears in her eyes too, but hers were tears of astonishment, of pride, of clinical disbelief turned into belief. "I guess we proved them wrong," Emma whispered. Jackson looked back at Storm, who stood in the middle of the round pen, head raised, ears forward, watching Emma walk away. "No," he said, "you proved them wrong. I just gave you a place to do it." The next day, Walter Green arrived at Ramsey Crossroads with a fresh contract in hand, ready to begin the sale process to the California breeder he'd been talking with for weeks. Jackson met him at the gate. "You're too late," he said, handing Walter a certified check. "I found a buyer." Walter stared. "What are you talking about? That's not even what the horse is worth." "He's not a product," Jackson replied. "He's not yours anymore. He's not anyone's, really. But the check is legal, the transfer's done, and the Mustang stays here." "Who's the buyer?" Walter demanded. Jackson glanced toward the barn, where Emma sat on a hay bale brushing Storm's coat. Her braces rested on the ground beside her. She looked lighter than he'd ever seen her, like someone not weighed down by limits anymore. "Someone who understands him," Jackson said. Walter scoffed and walked away, but the battle had been won. Not the bet, not the headlines, but something far more valuable. A wild horse and a determined girl, both once written off, had found their way to each other. And in doing so, they reminded a town and a man that the right connection could do more than defy odds. It could change everything.